I spent a lot of time there looking in their newspaper reels. I'd like to think that I've matured a little bit since then, that I don't know everything as I thought that I did back then. And one of the things that was wonderful about the collection was hundreds of photographs. There's hundreds and hundreds of photographs. And so this is just a photograph of a Hualapai family around 1900.
Where is that museum?
It's in Kingman, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. It's in Kingman. It's a really good museum. And since then, they've expanded it. So it's a really good museum. During the early 20th century, two of the things that they dealt with the most was the boarding school and issues of land, which is primarily issues of resources. So the Hualapai actually asked, or several leaders asked, that a boarding school be constructed in the present location of Valentine, where the superintendency is, the agency is. And the superintendency and the boarding school are about 12 miles from the Hualapai reservation. So they asked for this school to be built there for a couple reasons. Number one is that many Hualapai kids were being sent out, in particular to Albuquerque and Santa Fe boarding schools, taken from their home against their will, etc., etc. And several kids that died in these schools, primarily from measles, tuberculosis, etc., etc. But also, in some cases, they died because of a broken heart. They died because of sadness, sometimes malnutrition. The boarding schools, as bad as they may seem, and they did contribute to cultural genocide. I know that's a very difficult word. I don't throw that out there lightly. A lot of kids also made the best that they could of these schools. They learned English. They learned manual labor. And so they tried to make the best of these schools. Some kids had a good time. I interviewed for a project with the Hualapai, interviewed about 12 people who went to the boarding school before it closed in 1937. They had a good time. they got beaten, they got whipped for different things, but they figured, oh, that's just the way it goes. They didn't cry over it. They were locked down in basements against the heaters. They didn't cry about it. They said, well, they taught us discipline, they gave us food, they got 3 squares a day, taught us a meal. So it's a mix. Again, it's a mixture of things. In 1937, they closed the boarding school because they were so instead of bringing people from around the Southwest, they closed that and they just kept it as a day school. Okay? So I'm sorry. Some of the leaders made a compromise. They said, we'll send our kids to school if you put that school near us. I'm sorry. So some of these leaders saw the value of getting this education, while at the same time, they were very worried about the treatment of their children. So they said, we'll send our kids to school, but we want our children close. That's a pretty normal response for a parent, I would think. And then the big thing is land rights. So the situation with the Santa Fe Railway that started in 1833, the railway said that it claimed that it had ownership of a third of the reservation. This land dispute went on until the 1940s. So Hualapai leaders kept pushing the Bureau of Indian Affairs, members of Congress, etc., to address this land rights issue. Because the railroad not only took land that was good for grazing, if you have good land for grazing, you probably have some water, which means some springs. And so this is one of the reasons why the majority of Hualapais did not live on that reservation in any significant numbers until the mid to late 1940s. Because the agents were also selling grazing rights to ranchers, and then the Santa Fe Railway. So it's a very peculiar situation to have nearly 1 million acres that very few Hualapais could use. There are some folks, Hualapai folks, who gave me some photographs to use. This is one, her name is Camille Nighthorse, and she's the granddaughter of a gentleman that I'll talk about in a moment named Fred Mahone. And Fred Mahone is the guy over here in the black hat. And I talked with some of his with some of his ancestors. They said that he really loved these big black hats. He really liked these big black hats. And then when the movies came out, a lot of the bad guys wore black hats. Whether they were Indians or Anglos or whatever, so he liked that idea of kind of being the ornery bad guy. And to a person, everybody agreed that he was ornery, loquacious, opinionated, mean, but this guy, more than anybody else, saved the Hualapai Reservation. So we'll get to him in a second. One of the interesting things about this point in time is that there was really a lot of interaction between Hualapais and non-Hualapais. In and around Kingman, in and around Seligman, a lot of interaction. There were immigrants that were coming to the area from around Europe. There were immigrants that were coming from Mexico. There were Chinese that had been here for the railroad. And there's actually a lot of photographs and documentation about Hualapais, Chemehuevis, Mojaves going into Kingman for celebrations. Ironically, the 4th of July. Big celebrations for 4th of July. Big barbecues. All kinds of competitions. And sometimes they were ethnically sort of oriented to the Indians versus the whites, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes they weren't. One of the things that was also going on, a lot of economic interaction, in particular between Hualapai women who were making baskets, making jewelry, things like that, and selling them at the Santa Fe Railway. And this is an early form of tourism. Okay, this is an early form of tourism, essentially. The Santa Fe Railway had something called the Harvey cars and the Harvey girls. And they would go through the West and have these tours. And sometimes they employed Hualapais on the railway, in the kitchens, of course, or handing bag handlers. I came across 3 men who were bag handlers. But they made these stops, and one of the attractions at the stops were women who were selling jewelry and different things like that. So this is in Kingman. So during the early 20th century, as Hualapais were trying to adjust to all these different changes, there's activism going on. Now we sometimes think about activism as just the 1950s civil rights movement. Well, I would bet that people are always kind of activists for different ideas and goals and different purposes. But for the Hualapai, as time went on during the early 20th century, they started to go across a lot of these different band differences. They started to try to get organized because they were experiencing the same things. Wage labor, boarding schools, different types of segregation. But the big thing that bound them all together was their dislike for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the Office of Indian Affairs, as it was called. And the Office of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, to many Hualapais, was the root of all evil. Okay, these were the people that were blamed for everything. So they critiqued the Bureau for all kinds of different things. And when I was doing the archival research, I just came across tons and tons of documents where Hualapais were writing letters to the Arizona Territorial Governor, writing letters to U.S. representatives, even though they were not U.S. citizens until 1924. Writing letters to the presidents, saying we fought in the Indian Wars against those Apaches. We should get some respect. Okay? And these are the things that brought them together. And so they've had these criticisms like Roger Habitone. We are not free people. We are prisoners. We were here first before any whites came to this country. And so there was that rhetoric, but then they were also worked with what they called, quote, good white people. And they recognized that. They recognized that there were many people that would help them out. All communities, all cultures have, quote, good and bad. And so some of the organizations that they created, and the spelling is, quote, correct, even though it's incorrect. The Red Men Self-Dependent of America, that meant self-independent. There was a string of ideas about independence. We want to be left alone. We want to be left alone. They created different organizations, and then they had a tribal council before a new tribal council was more or less imposed on them in the 1930s. So some of the leaders, this guy down here, Hualapai Charlie, was one of the most prominent and well-known leaders during the late 19th century and early 20th century. And I'm wearing the characteristic headdress, the turkey feathers. And then these guys over here, slightly different attire. But it, to some extent, speaks to a mixture of approaches and a mixture, what I call a hybrid system, where they got these old guys, that's what they call them, no offense, this is what these young guys are saying in the documents, I need to make that clear. Got these old guys who spoke Hualapai, many of whom were born in the 1850s and 1860s. Some of whom were born when Arizona was Mexico, to cooperate with the young guys, or the young fellas, which was in the documents, the young fellas who had been through boarding schools, spoke English, and then after World War II, after World War I, had been in World War I. So there's this mixture of old and new. And then Hualapai Charlie, again, is right, and this is the cover of the book, he's right here. And this is what I was kind of trying to say about things are complicated, there's mixtures. This is the 4th of July parade in Kingman. So they would have three-legged races. They would have horseshoes. They would have rodeos. And then something that they called a chicken pull, which I'm not quite sure. I think I get that. You know, there were different views on what that really was. But these competitions and there was cultural interaction. A lot starts to change in the 1930s in the United States and also for Native people. There were a couple dozen Hualapais that served in World War I, actually. A gentleman that I'll refer to called Sam Swaskagame served in France. Hualapais and Native people across the United States were generally not United States citizens. And some didn't want to be United States citizens, actually. So it's a combination of things. And this is one of the things that, again, makes things very, very complicated with Indian affairs today. Some of them wanted that, and some of them did not want that. Whether or not they wanted it or not, Congress passed the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. This was unilateral. Some people said, great, finally. Some people said, we didn't ask for this. So again, a mixture of things. During the 1930s, we know the New Deal programs. In particular, the New Deal programs targeted Native people. It's what they called the, quote, Indian New Deal. There was different parts to it. Some of it dealt with educational reform. So they closed down dozens of boarding schools across the country and opened up day schools. They also stopped this process of allotment that began in 1887. So in 1887, the federal government, Congress really, under the Dawes Allotment Act, began to cut up reservations across the country and then sell them off at auction. And this is the source of a lot of the checkerboards that are across the American West on Indian reservations. And in some cases, especially in places like Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas and Nebraska, some reservations are 70% checkerboard. So you'll have the external boundary of the reservation, but inside there are these pockets or checkerboards of private property. Creates huge problems for economic development. This is one of the reasons why, for instance, you go on to many native reservations and there's a lot of poverty. So they don't have actually full control over their land in the literal sense because of this checkerboard process, but also in the bureaucratic sense with the federal government. So they ended this process of allotment. Okay? One of the big, big parts of the Indian New Deal was to focus on tribal governance and economic development. Key to this was the establishment of what are called IRA governments or IRA constitutions. These were essentially boilerplate, one-size-fits-all governments that they put onto many native tribes with a short period of voting that were heavy on the executive branch. And after Congress got a hold of the first proposal from John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Collier had this big sweeping proposal for radically rechanging Indian life. Congress got a hold of this and gutted a lot of it, in particular the section dealing with Indian courts. So when the Hualapais got to vote, the small minority voted for it. A few people voted against it, but John Collier took the non-votes and counted them as yes votes.